Since I first played FF14 on May 28th of 2020, this login screen has greeted me almost every single day. And while many find it obnoxious or just stupidly loud, I will never get tired of getting goosebumps from the roaring vocals and the way the screen lights up with the scene of the Veil of Light splitting open to reveal the night sky. I mean, how could I get tired of it? This starting screen is the one that has been there since I started and throughout my adventures in what has become one of my favorite games ever made, housing my favorite story ever told not only in a video game, but in any form of media. Despite the fact that it destroys my eardrums in the morning when I log in, and floods my previously dark room with a, well, flood of light, this is a formative and already nostalgic memory for me with the game, even if it hasn't been replaced yet. Final Fantasy XIV was my first MMO I actually played seriously. Aside from around 70 or so hours screwing around in ESO across a few years, this was it. Back when the pandemic truly began where I live, I turned to the world of MMOs to fill those suddenly empty days, and I started working my way down the list of the most popular ones and ones that had come out more recently, even making videos on them, which now I'll sit on my archive channel. But while not being long enough for those videos to get off the ground, but plenty long enough to bounce straight off of WoW, I found myself playing FF14 and my life was completely consumed by it, effectively making the worst of the pandemic to me seem like it never existed. From there, I worked my way through the entire main story, fell in with a more high-end FC who taught me the more advanced ropes of the game, I got into raiding for the first time in any game, and had all sorts of adventures and misadventures in the game, cataloging many of them here on this channel to share with others, and as time marched on, here we are, at the very end of the Shadowbringers era. Everything I mentioned a minute ago is what encapsulates the whole era for me. It was a time filled with so many new experiences I'd never had before in gaming, and books upon books worth of memories and video scripts, and as pathetic as it may sound, it took away much of the monotony that came along with my day-to-day life. So as my last video of this expansion, I wanted to make this one to share my personal experiences throughout this era of the game, and the memories I will carry on with me in order to, when it is time, be able to happily say, so long, Shadowbringers. The most logical place to begin a video like this would of course be the beginning. It was the beginning of when the pandemic really started getting bad back before the summer of 2020, and with the ridiculous amount of free time I found myself now having, I decided to truly jump into an MMO for the first time. My mind swayed by a myriad of YouTube videos and other media that had given me this extremely strange longing of sorts to immerse myself in such a game as I was seeing. So I made a list of popular MMOs and started to work my way down. I'd played a fair bit of ESO extremely casually in the past, but could never really get into it. I didn't even get 10 hours into BDO before getting bored and annoyed by the cash shop constantly popping up. I didn't quite jive with the lobby-based action of PSO2, and for some reason I managed to find myself absolutely despising nearly every aspect of Terra within an hour of beating its abysmal tutorial. So I moved on to the game that was the poster boy of MMOs, and the one I was absolutely convinced would pull me in. Good old World of Warcraft. Well, a single look at my YouTube channel will pretty quickly tell you all you need to know about how that went. I made it to the free trial level cap on multiple characters and just found myself not able to get into it for whatever reason, which after convincing myself that this would be the game for me really left me bummed out. Though, soon after I would quickly learn that the game I was told about and so excited to try hadn't been that way since 2010. So in hindsight, if I had done my research, I could have avoided that whole kerfuffle, but you know, I didn't. The next game up on the list was FF14, a game that I'd heard of a few times before, with many people I knew online having at least tried it, with some actually getting pretty deep into it. Unlike seemingly everyone else who has tried the game in recent memory, going in I knew nothing more than the fact that it existed. So just as systematically as I'd moved through the other MMOs I had tried, I downloaded the game and started it up. And right off the bat there was something different about 14 to all of the other games I'd played so far. Whether it was the beautiful city of Ul'dah, the desert plains of Phandalin, which I adored at first sight, the character that I'd actually enjoyed creating and put effort into, or just simple desperation for wanting to fall into an MMO, I found myself actually becoming engrossed in 14. It was a huge world that I knew absolutely nothing about, and I had no preconceived notions like some ex-WoW player who'd been burned for years and has been led to believe 14 was some weird fetish game, and considering at the time of 1.0's original launch, I wasn't even 5 years old yet, I didn't know anything about the game being nigh on unplayable garbage at any point. And unlike some FF series vet who was just looking for a good Final Fantasy fix, I had no such draw. While I knew about the history and respected the legacy of the series, the only experience I had with it before 14 was Final Fantasy Explorers on the 3DS, which I never played for more than 5 hours as a kid, and Final Fantasy XIV, which is a game I will never be able to finish without being bored to tears. So it was a strange thing when I suddenly hit the then free trial cap of level 35 and was unable to progress what I was doing any further. I then checked my playtime and found I had already sunk nearly a day of my life into the game in the span of less than a week. And in that moment, I realized just how much I was enjoying the game and how much it was pulling me in. So despite being a basically broke 14-year-old at the time, I ponied up enough money to grab the complete edition and just kept on going, beginning the long journey through the MSQ with the end goal of hitting level 80. If there is one distinct advantage to getting into 14 years after its release and halfway through an expansion cycle, it is the fact of just how much content there is to work through just to get to max level and the end of the current MSQ. I joined the game in the last few months or so of 5.2, so I had just under 7 years of content to work my way through. In the month of game time that came with the complete edition, I managed to get through all of ARR and the 2.x patches, as well as the first 20 quests or so of Heavensward. I would have made it further in that time if I did not decide to focus heavily on grinding irregular tomestones in order to get some mounts that I thought were cool in the 5.2 tomestone exchange. So by the time I entered Heavensward, I was well over level 60 thanks to the amount of dungeons I ran. But with that time now being up and the fact that I had basically no money left, I had to cancel my sub since I couldn't afford it. But honestly, I credit this time where I couldn't play the game for how strongly I fell in love with it later on. This was right before the ARR revamp that took place in 5.3, so in order to access Heavensward, I had to play through every single quest that was cut out less than 2 months later. And even though 2.5 and the beginning of Heavensward were a lot more enjoyable than what had come before it, I was seriously starting to feel burnout on the game after trudging through the mud that is ARR for the previous month. There is a reason that the ARR filter is so powerful and claims so many new players, and it almost claimed me. In this time without the game, I went off and did other things, played other games, and had a great time. But after a few weeks, I found my mind returning to Eorzea. And thus, once I had the money, I renewed my sub and continued on with the game, which had now seen the release of patch 5.3. If I had continued to play after starting to feel that burnout after 2.x, I don't think I would have hit any kind of second wind, and no matter how good Heavensward got, I think that post-ARR hangover of sorts would have likely killed any and all enjoyment there was to be had, and I probably would have straight up abandoned the game. So in this scenario, being a broke teenager actually helped me, which is something I think that very few can say about any scenario. But with that break taken and my excitement to continue the game refreshed, I forged ahead, moving through Heavensward, 3.x, Stormblood, and 4.x in under 2 months and loving every second of it. In the process of playing through those expansions, the story fully pulled me in. I changed my character's look for a stupid reason in the story, and my new life as a walking ad for Square Enix officially began as I began to try and persuade friends of mine to get into the game. It's true what they say. You either quit having never completed ARR, or you become a walking, talking billboard that, like a black hole, tries to pull everything and everyone around you into the game. But with my multiple month-long journey through the base game and the first 2 expansions now out of the way, it was finally time to move into the content of Shadowbringers itself, the final and what would turn out to be the most incredible stretch yet of my journey to reach Endgame. According to the metadata of some screenshots I took, the very day I entered Shadowbringers was November 10th of 2020, and I was in for one hell of a ride. Shadowbringers is constantly praised for its narrative, and for good reason. The world of the first makes everything in the story fresh and interesting once more. The Veil of Light is an ever-looming and obvious threat that always keeps the player engaged and focused on their objectives. The writing and character building are simply superb, and the music and set pieces frame and complete the story in a way that it becomes nearly unforgettable for those who had given their undivided attention up to that point. I entered Shadowbringers at around level 74 on my Paladin, the only class I ever bothered to play up to that point. And after grinding Holminster Switch for a ridiculously long time for the Lakeland Fending set, which I proceeded not to use at all, and reached the point where I finally took down the Raktika Light Warden, I felt the rush of finally leveling up for the 79th time, and finally, after just over 200 hours, hitting the level cap of 80. From there, it was routine. I worked my way through the remainder of the base Shadowbringers story, laying low the final Light Warden before venturing into the empty ocean bubble that is the Tempest to take on and fell Hades, learning the name of the Crystal Exarch for the first time by selecting the "'Tis good to see you awake, Grahatia," a dialogue option that, since I hadn't completed Crystal Tower, made no sense but seemed appropriate. From there, I was forced to play through and complete the Crystal Tower questline, as since I had beaten A Realm Reborn and Heavensward back in 5.2, it had since become a required content to progress. So I went into my first MMO raid a giant bag of nerves, expecting to be absolutely obliterated in the 3 raids and even reading a raid guide for the Labyrinth of the Ancients. Soon enough, I realized what a waste of time that had been, as the whole Alliance raid series had become a joke in the 7 years since its introduction, so I just kinda flew through it without an issue in the span of a day. After completing the Crystal Tower and watching Grahatia seal himself away, I returned to the first to meet up with the current Grahatia and began the steady march through the MSQ 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3, completing my journey through the MSQ to that point with the fall of Elidibus on November 3rd of 2020. A fight which drained all of my gil I had saved up to get into, as my gear was utter trash and I had to buy a bunch of Neo-ish Guardian Fending gear in order to meet the item level requirements. That hurt my soul. But with the Scions now returned to the source and my screen for the first time ever adorned with the MSQ to be continued widgets, as well as my Paladin having reached level 80, I had finally done it. I had cleared the longest journey to max level that modern MMOs have to offer, and I had done so in quite good time, finally arriving at Final Fantasy XIV's endgame. It took no more than 10 hours for me to realize that Final Fantasy XIV handles its endgame in a very interesting way compared to other games in the genre. Everything that was available to me throughout the MSQ was still there and simply more abundant. The only real change was the fact I didn't really have any more MSQ to work through. To sum it up, I discovered that in many ways, the endgame in Final Fantasy XIV doesn't really exist in the way I would expect it to. 14 is a game that, unlike its counterparts, can't really be broken down into early game, leveling, and endgame. Instead, things from each expansion start unlocking as you progress through the story, and though the content from previous expansions is older and less active, it still exists in harmony with the newer stuff. Instead of gating all of its content behind the requirements of hitting what could be considered endgame, it gives all the content to you as you go. If you wanted to act like the game never received an update beyond Heavensward and only use 3.x gear and interact with 3.x content, ignoring all that came after it, in many ways you very much can, and it would not even be all that detrimental. All of 14's content since ARR exists in harmony, beckoning to you to come and experience it at your own pace and leisure. It doesn't push you towards anything and instead lets you explore what it has to offer on its own. And there are such systems in place to give you the best experience possible that it is still popular today to go back and progress through the Alexander Savage raids with all of your gear and attributes scaled down. Those are raids from Heavensward. At the time of recording this video, those are 6 years old. And even something as simple as gearing is completely optional outside of the item level requirement for certain content. You could truly just do whatever you wanted to do with nothing to guide you but whether you enjoyed it or not, which is something that I was shocked to find. But this sense of freedom and a lack of clear direction actually plays well into the game's favor, by giving you a better sense of actually existing in the world, and that the world around you is alive. Spread across all the years of content, there are players taking part, with very few things actually falling neglected. And even though apparently the core gameplay loop at max level has not changed in years, which many would consider to be the sign of a dying and stagnant game, 14 somehow manages to keep that feeling fresh by keeping your attention on everything around it rather than those progression systems themselves, encouraging you to think more about how you can have fun rather than how good your gear is. Which in a genre whose player base historically has been obsessed with arbitrary numbers is a nice breath of fresh air. So with the freedom I was given, I decided to plunge into the harder content the game has to offer. A few days after hitting 80 as I continued to move through the MSQ, I joined up with an FC focused on raiding and other endgame activities that was looking for new members and willing to mentor new players into competent endgame ones. As my first excursion into the world of high-end content, that FC brought me into the Seed of Sacrifice Extreme less than a week after I beat the MSQ. And it was set to be a true trial by fire for me, a player who thought the proper way to play Paladin was to only use the Royal Authority combo and to never use spells, only using my magic attacks to unleash Confiteor after Requiescat. Why did I think like this? Who the hell knows? But I can say for certain that got straightened out quite quickly. Despite going for multiple lockouts and having a great deal of personal improvements, I never ended up getting the clear in SOS, with the closest that learning party ever got being well into the second phase with a 15% wipe. However, a few weeks later I did manage to learn and clear a fight that is no longer in the game just an hour or so before the maintenance for the 5.4 release went underway. That fight was the Akafa Amphitheater Unreal, and the fact I managed to learn and clear that fight within the span of a single lockout at the skill level I had reached at that time continues to surprise me to this day. Both the launch of 5.4 and the completion of my first current high-end duty at the time, I considered my initiation to the endgame complete, and I spent the next while improving my own gameplay and knowledge of my main class of Paladin with the intention of beginning to try and join a Savage static within my FC, though that eventually turned into creating my own. But as 5.4 hit and I truly began to get used to being at endgame and doing my best to complete what content I could, I decided to give something else another go to try and chronicle my experiences at endgame in a way that I could look back upon in the future. And that desire led to the rebirth of this channel and my love for making videos and streaming, which from that point on is directly tied to my experiences in 14 in a majority of ways. But that's a different story for a different time you didn't click on this video to hear. But with those last couple sections out of the way, let's move on to my actual highlights of the expansion and what I personally enjoyed the most about it. So, expansion highlights. Boy oh boy, where do I begin? There are quite a lot of things that I could list that I experienced during the Shadowbringers expansion, but for the sake of keeping with the theme of this particular X-Pack, I'll try my best to only keep to things that came along during this expansion's content cycle. So even though everything I've experienced in the game so far has been during Shadowbringers, I'll keep the stuff that just came out from June 2019 and beyond. Now then, to avoid possible pitchforks coming out and being pointed in my direction, if I don't mention it as the very first thing, a major highlight of this expansion was its story. Shadowbringers had an absolutely incredible plot full of highs and lows, amazing characters, great pacing, and it basically ticked every single box an incredibly written story needs to tick to reach that status. The base expansion on its own wove an amazing tale that was a joy to experience, and the story then went from strength to strength with the amazing patches 5.1 to 5.3 to finish up the main Shadowbringers plotlines, and basically anything involving the first for the foreseeable future. And then moving on to the pretty good patches that were 5.4 and 5.5 to set up the story for Endwalker to follow. Overall, the MSQ was absolutely fantastic in this expansion, and for more in-depth detail, you can check out my 3 So I Played FF14 videos that focus on 5.0 and its patches, as combined they are over an hour and a half long, and I really don't want to summarize all that here. But that verdict of being incredible is before looking at the Chronicles of a New Era questlines for this expansion, which were Eden, the Tsar of Werlyt, and Yorha Dark Apocalypse. Now, I haven't gotten around to actually playing through Dark Apocalypse quite yet, and I can blame the copious amount of time it takes me to make videos for that, but I have completed the other 2. Eden was pretty decent and probably tied for my second favorite raid series with Omega, with my favorite being Binding Coils of Bahamut, which I doubt they will ever be able to beat in a raid storyline. Though, that's a challenge to Pandemonium more than anything. Anyway, they did a really good job in Eden exploring the ideas of the Empty and the fate that had befallen the rest of Norvrant during the Flood of Light. And even though there were some more low-key and slow parts that I feel kinda dragged down the storyline at times, it was overall pretty solid and engaging. The fights were also pretty damn good and for the most part actually pretty enjoyable on normal difficulty, which is something I feel that not many fights in the game can boast outside of their first run. Eden at times feels like a greatest hits album of bosses from past storylines, but the music and actual fight designs themselves definitely lifted that up where it threatened to fall flat. Of course, this is just talking about the normal fights, as the Savages I have completed are a whole other ball of wax, and I've only cleared a few of them, so I won't be going into those here. As for the Tsar of Werlyt, that storyline was fucking incredible, and it is filled with some of my favorite story moments, characters, cutscenes, and dialogue in the entire game. No joke, if I put this next to each expansion on a rating list, it would be second only to the Shadowbringers story. Full on bias here, but this questline is an absolute masterpiece. The emotional drive behind the whole story and how it expands on its main character, who is seemingly just a convenient plot device cast to the side, as well as their life story, past actions and their consequences, and different pieces of lore only thrown out in the past is unparalleled. And that ending, oh my god, that ending has got to be one of the most satisfying things I've ever witnessed in storytelling, period. 10 out of 10. As for the fights, Cinder Drift and Castrum Meridianum are kind of a joke on normal, but the final trial, called the Cloud Deck, is actually quite difficult for a lot of Duty Finder groups and can lead to quite a few fun wipes. I've actually completed all of these fights on Extreme as well, and Cinder Drift is pretty decent if I remember correctly. I cleared it once in one lockout with my old FC back in 5.4 after getting no sleep the night before and kinda running around like a chicken with my head cut off. But it's a fun fight. Then there's Castrum Meridianum Extreme, which is a fight I know a little too well, as its rare drop, the Emerald Glibber, has evaded me for almost a year now across a ridiculous number of clears and heartbreaking moments of it dropping in farm parties, only for me to never roll over a 50. But well, as much as I'd like to act like I hate that fight, it's actually pretty damn good. And the Cloud Deck Extreme is a really fun fight with some interesting mechanics, but is by far and away the easiest of the 3, and possibly one of the easiest extremes in Shadowbringers, making the fact that it's the one that awards 2 totems per kill kind of an insult. If Emerald dropped 2 totems, I would have the Gwibber by now. I think about this every night. It haunts me. The day I get the damn Gwibber will be one of the happiest in recent memory. And then I can put this whole thing behind me. Moving on. Let's talk about the zones this expansion, which were all pretty good, and all of them, aside from Ilmeg, which I personally don't like, largely due to its layout, are going to be zones I miss being endgame zones and having high turnout for things like rare fates and hunt trains. Lakeland, the Amarang, Kalusha, Raktika, the Tempest, and fine, even Ilmeg are incredible looking zones and are all extremely unique to anything else in the game. And even though the Endwalker looks to have amazing zones as well, I don't think those will collectively top the Shadowbringers zones as a unit, to me at least. And that may just be nostalgia on my part, but who knows. There were also the 2 cities in this expansion, Yulmore and the Crystarium. And while I am actually not a huge fan of Yulmore, I adore the Crystarium. Ishgard may still be the city that has my heart, but in many ways the Crystarium is kind of a much grander, much larger, inverse version of Ishgard. I swear that sentence makes sense. The Crystarium is so bright and colorful, and I love the fact that it's basically a giant castle courtyard turned city with the beautiful crystal tower at its center. The giant domed areas are amazing, with all of them being unique, from a giant marketplace to a large library, an indoor garden, a stunning aetheryte plaza, and what is essentially a giant apartment building. The layout is also spectacular with its semicircle design with all of the different levels and the giant flat courtyard in the middle with all of the gold accents and metal running throughout everything. This is all compared to Ishgard's more gothic / steampunk take on a giant castle city. I could honestly go on for hours about all the little details in the Crystarium, but I'll end off by saying that I don't think it is going to be dethroned as my number 2 city for a long time. For the next highlight, I want to talk about my absolute favorite content in Shadowbringers that, despite having had a pretty bumpy ride throughout the X-Pack and causing me personally a lot of headaches, I just can't help but love. And that content is, or rather was, Save the Queen. This, as many are no doubt aware, was an evolution of Stormblood's Eureka, basically keeping all the core ideas of new zones filled with tough enemies, giant semi-instance boss encounters, and full-on giant raids that players could trigger through their actions in the zone, all with its own independent leveling system. Except in Shadowbringers, they revamped a lot of this to be far more user and honestly casual friendly than Eureka was. Now, when I say that Save the Queen content was my favorite thing, I by no means mean that I actually enjoyed doing the Relic, as thanks to the honestly abysmal drop rates of Relic upgrading items that dropped in Save the Queen zones, I just fucked off and did the alternate methods of collecting the necessary items outside of Bozja, as it was much more efficient. By my favorite content, I mean literally everything and anything else Save the Queen brought with it, except that Relic bullshit. Before getting into the really good stuff I've spent countless hours on, let's touch on the story of Save the Queen, which is also pretty damn good. The story serves as a sequel of sorts to the Return to Evil's Alliance raids from Stormblood, focusing on the Bozjan resistance that was first mentioned there, bringing back some characters from that plotline. Thematically, it also kind of continues the Gunbreaker job quest with the amount of references to Bozja and even some common characters. In this storyline, we join up with the Bozjan resistance to take back Bozja from the Garlean Empire and topple the 4th Imperial Legion once and for all. The storylines across the new Save the Queen zones of both the Bozjan Southern Front and Zadnor progress as the player ranks up by completing battles in a sector of the zone. And once the Resistance has captured that area in the story, you move on to the next sector, with both zones' stories climaxing in big 48-man raids that I'll get into specifically in a minute. The cast of characters, plot, and overall storytelling in this content is actually pretty good, and so is getting to unravel the very interesting lore and mysteries that surround Bozja and its queen Gunhildr. Overall, it's a solid tale that is far better than one would initially expect from this kind of content, and the only real bad thing about it is that it doesn't have its own New Game Plus chapter. So hopefully Yoshi P will realize his mistake and rectify it in the near future, as such an error is nigh on unforgivable. But now then, let's talk about the 2 zones in Save the Queen, the Bozjan Southern Front and Zadnor. They're both quite barren, but kinda beautiful in their own way. Well, at least Zadnor, which is very alien-seeming at times, while the Southern Front is basically a giant free-roam version of the Gimlet Dark, which is by no means a criticism of it. While I think the Southern Front has the edge in most cases when comparing the two, both in zone design and content, they are both extremely cool and filled with all sorts of fun critical engagements with some really fun and challenging fights that are super fast-paced with all sorts of mechanics to memorize and evade, and there are very few that I actually don't enjoy. Even the good old murderous red chocobo that made its return from Eureka to continue to wreak havoc and haunt the dreams of the player base is a really fun encounter, and if not for the fight itself, then to simply watch the chat box. The fates in these zones, renamed as skirmishes, are also far more enjoyable than standard fates out in the normal zones, thanks to both having more interesting objectives, being more difficult than your standard fates, and being a part of a large group of players rushing from fate to fate, decimating them one by one. And if you die to some random mechanic or AoE gore, you're probably going to get left behind as the party charges on. It really does feel like you're going to war in these zones alongside an army of players, encouraged by the incredible and extremely fitting music in these zones. Though rushing a cluster of machines or normal enemies with an army of warriors of light all hellbent on fast leveling, getting relic items, or looking for missing field notes, and once they are beaten to the ground, everyone mounts up to run to the other side of the zone and kill more enemies while those ones are still twitching on the ground, is hilarious if not slightly intimidating. And then there are the 3 raids that came out during Save the Queen. Those being Castrum Lacus Latore in the Bosnian Southern Front, Delubrum Regine, which is a separate instance, and the Dalriada in Zadnor. All of these raids are a great time no matter how many times I run them, with the exception of Delubrum Regine, which can get pretty damn frustrating depending on the party makeup and experience. Each of these raids are very unique to the others, with their own unique objectives to accomplish, like dividing and saving prisoners in CLL, making your way through some booby-trapped hallways with your only guide being some players hanging back to fight enemies in another room in Dalriada, or simply praying to the 12 that your party doesn't wipe on one of the bosses in DR. Every boss encounter is extremely well designed, unique, and most importantly a lot of fun. Everything in between is also very enjoyable, far more so than you would expect different trash mobs or mechanics to be. And the feeling of rushing a giant stronghold with a large party and crushing literally everything in your path was exhilarating. And the strict time limit of each of them, especially CLL back when it was first added, kept you on your toes. I've had so much fun in Save the Queen content since back when I first found out about it in 5.3, and I really hope we see something like it again, though hopefully without the absolutely abysmal drop rates of relic items. Then it would be perfect. To close off this section of the video and begin to wrap up, I just want to go over some memories that I will carry on from this expansion, the vast majority being good, but some being a bit more sour. I want to first and somewhat randomly touch on the towers which popped up in every zone upon completion of 5.4. While nice or to some, no doubt, I personally find them incredibly cool. The Telophoroi and Fandaniel immediately made a splash with these things as they announced their doomsday plot. And with such an extreme and constantly looming threat, what better way is there to show it than a tower literally looming over every single zone in the game? Just suddenly appearing when the lead up to Endwalker truly began and we started to learn about and understand just exactly what we're going up against. What better way to constantly remind and hype up a player base for a new expansion than that? You'd think I'd be sick of them after being forced to stare at them for almost a year now without any real build up to them quite yet, but I haven't and I don't know why. Taking a step back from the immediate future and the plot to destroy the entire world for, what is it, the 8th and final time now, let's take a rapid fire look at other memories of mine from this expansion. I tried raiding for the first time in any MMO with my venture into Savage, which involved creating my own static of newer players, which ended up dying in 2 weeks, but I enjoyed it while it lasted. I then tried to build another static with the core of those who remained from the previous one. That died too, but I still had fun with it, which is what truly matters. Then there was the Ishgardian Restoration, which was a really cool thing to get to be a part of, even if it was only for the final stage. Getting to rebuild a residential district in my favorite city is already cool enough, but the fact that each server's actions left a permanent and a unique touch on every server is something that I've never seen in any game before. And the fact that the actions of myself and the rest of the player base to build something up that will forever endure as part of the game through the Imperium Housing District is extremely special and something I am very grateful to have gotten the chance to be a part of, as minuscule as my role was. The Firmament Celebration feats were also a sight to behold on release with how massive the turnout turned out to be during each event on launch, and getting to almost hear the servers crying as a pack of players far too big for the server to render and handle at once descended on the fledgling district every 2 hours. If this was real life, we would need to rebuild the whole thing again after accidentally destroying it with all that many people. Every single patch day turned into a nice memory of joining the swarm of players rushing around the world to experience all the new content. And even the small and annoying things that, like someone standing on top of the NPC you need to interact with, making it extremely hard to get to interact with them, turns into a funny thing you can have a chuckle at a few days later. Discovering and taking part in countless hunt trains is another highlight. Flying around to kill a bunch of monsters as part of a giant army was already really cool, but seeing all the different mounts really does make it a sight to behold, with the flying army being a mix of everything from a basic Final Fantasy chocobo to all kinds of dragons to fucking Jibanyan from Yokai Watch, with a player sitting in its lap. It doesn't get much funnier than seeing something like that so out of place. I held a dueling tournament in the Excalibur Wolves Den to celebrate hitting 1,000 subs, which feels like a million years ago now. And despite being extremely scuffed, it was so much fun not only to organize it all and watch it play out, but it is even funnier to know that behind the scenes, I had accidentally bought about 10 million gil worth of enchanted elm lumber the day prior, and wouldn't have enough money to pay out the prize pool if an FC member hadn't bailed me out. Closest call I've ever had to widespread public embarrassment in my life so far. And that's just a few things. Every video I've made on my channel has memories associated with it, or is structured around a memory of a story I have from playing the game. It's rare that you can say this about a piece of media, let alone an MMO that siphons away thousands of hours of your life, but since I started playing it, FF14 has enriched my life and made every day so much more enjoyable. Weird to say out loud, but it's the truth. So that is more or less the story of my time with Shadowbringers. All the missing pieces or smaller details not included here are probably chronicled in some other video. The Shadowbringers era and my time playing the game during it has been absolutely incredible. I've had so much fun, accomplished my goal of finding an MMO to be immersed in, made so many memories to look back on fondly in the years to come, in basically all aspects of the game and things adjacent to it. And I've gotten to meet a bunch of new people along the way, a few of whom I can safely say I can now call friends. The only way I think it could have possibly gone better is if the static I created hadn't fallen apart and I had actually cleared the tier. Though if that had happened, I might not have started making videos again. So, probably a blessing in disguise in the long run. My hopes going into the next expansion are pretty standard, although lofty. I hope that the Endwalker MSQ brings everything to a proper and satisfying conclusion, whether it be a happy or sad ending. I plan to get more involved in the Savage raiding scene and tackle all the tiers in Pandemonium while they are current, and have at least one ultimate cleared by the time 7.0 comes around. I hope to meet more cool people that I can become friends with and play with, and I hope I will actually manage to drag one of my friends into the game past the tutorial section, so hopefully I will do something to combat the ARR filter, because it's kinda getting insane. I'm like 0 for 5 at this point. But of course, what matters to me the most is that the game remains in a healthy state throughout Endwalker and continues to grow, and for it to remain just as fun and simply be another equal, if not more enjoyable and memorable time than what I've experienced throughout the Shadowbringers expansion. As long as it can meet those very basic things, I will be more than content at the end of the day. But I think after all of that, I'm out of things to say. The time since I started playing the game over a year and a half ago now has flown by in a flash, and I've loved every second of my time with it. And here's to another 2 or more great years with Endwalker just around the corner. But with that, for the final time this expansion, it's time to end off the video. If you liked the video and haven't already, do consider subscribing and leaving a like, as it really does help out a lot. As always, my name is Lokidum, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in Endwalker.